They didn't tell me about the rules when I took the job, but maybe I wouldn't have believed them if they had. At $25 an hour for a night shift, I wasn't asking many questions. When you're running from your past, you take what you can get, and the RMS Sovereign seemed like a godsend. An old luxury liner docked in Long Beach, it had been turned into a floating museum. From the outside, it looked regal, even majestic, with its towering smokestacks and sleek design. Inside, though, it was a different story. Time hadn't been kind to the Sovereign. It was a hollow, creaking monument to another era, one that smelled faintly of salt and decay. I arrived for my first shift just as the sun was setting. The day manager, a wiry man named Robert, didn't bother with pleasantries. He handed me a set of keys and a clipboard with a checklist that included the usual security tasks: lock the doors, check the exhibits, keep an eye out for vandals. Stick to the routine, don't wander off, and whatever you do, don't fall asleep, he said, his voice carrying an edge I didn't expect. He avoided eye contact, glancing nervously at the ship behind me. Anything else I should know? I asked, half joking, trying to lighten the mood. He hesitated for a moment before saying, "Yeah, don't go poking around where you don't belong." His tone made it clear the conversation was over. Once Robert left, I took a moment to survey the ship. The Sovereign was massive, its corridors a maze of faded grandeur. The polished wood paneling and Art Deco accents had lost their luster, but you could tell it had once been a symbol of wealth and power. The grand staircase near the lobby, though slightly warped, still carried an air of elegance, its banisters gleaming faintly in the dim light. I couldn't shake the feeling that the ship was watching me, the way sound seemed to die in the thick, oppressive air. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I did my rounds, checked the exhibits, and spent a lot of time in the security office, a cramped little room filled with outdated monitors and a coffee maker that looked older than me. Around midnight, I decided to explore more of the ship. It felt like the kind of place that had stories buried in its walls. Maybe I'd even write about it one day, if I could get my head straight enough to string together more than a few sentences. That's when I found the note. It was tucked in a drawer of the security desk, yellowed with age and written in a sharp, slanted handwriting. At first, I thought it was just another checklist, but as I read, a cold knot formed in my stomach. Rules for the night watch. Rule number 1. If you see a captain in uniform, do not speak to him. Rule number 2. Don't touch the gold coins on the table in the captain's quarters. Rule number 3. If the ship's bell rings at midnight, stay where you are and don't move until it stops. Rule number 4. Never look into the porthole windows after 3 a.m. Rule number 5. If you hear whistling in the engine room, leave immediately. Rule number 6. Always lock the security office door before starting rounds. At the bottom of the page, written in bold, underlined letters, was one final warning: breaking these rules invites the wrath of the ship's true master. I stared at the list for what felt like forever. It had to be a joke, some kind of hazing ritual for the new guy. Still, there was something unsettling about the paper, the way the words seemed etched into the page as if whoever wrote them had done so in a frenzy. I folded the note and shoved it in my pocket. My mind wandered to the last job I had, the one I left behind after a confrontation with a coworker turned violent. I thought this gig would be simple, something to help me lay low and rebuild, but now, I wasn't so sure. I decided to stick to the checklist Robert had given me, ignoring the rules for the time being. I'd made it through tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. I wasn't about to get spooked by ghost stories. The ship creaked and groaned as I walked the empty halls, the sound of my boots echoing off the walls. Shadows stretched and twisted under the dim emergency lights, but I told myself it was nothing. By the time I made it back to the security office, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed from the eerie silence. I locked the door behind me, more out of habit than anything else, and collapsed into the chair. The night had been strange, sure, but nothing I couldn't handle. I figured the hardest part of the job would be staying awake until sunrise. Then, somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint, unmistakable toll of a bell. At first, I thought I had imagined it. The sound was faint, almost like it had been carried on the wind, but I knew there wasn't any wind inside this ship. My initial instinct was to dismiss it. Bells don't just ring by themselves, and the ship was supposed to be abandoned at night. But as the toll came again, heavier this time, a chill ran down my spine. The noise seemed to be coming from the heart of the ship, echoing through its hollow corridors. I stayed seated in the security office, frozen, as the third chime sounded. The air in the room felt heavier, pressing down on my chest. I thought of the note in my pocket, specifically the third rule: if the ship's bell rings at midnight, stay where you are and don't move until it stops. My logical brain fought against the rising fear. It had to be a prank or some old mechanism that had malfunctioned. But then, why had the rule been so specific? Why the warning? The bell tolled again, louder, deeper. The sound seemed to vibrate through the ship, and I gripped the arms of my chair, unsure what to do. I reminded myself of my training. Situations like this needed calm and observation, not panic. But all my military instincts screamed that I wasn't dealing with something normal. As the tolls continued, a dreadful thought crept into my mind. I didn't know how many chimes there were supposed to be. 12? 13? More? The 10th toll brought a noise outside the security office door, a soft shuffle, like someone pacing back and forth. My breath hitched. I stared at the door, half expecting someone to knock or barge in, but nothing happened. My grip on the armrests tightened. Then I remembered, always lock the security office door before starting rounds. At least I had done that. But whoever, or whatever, was out there now knew where I was. The 11th chime was almost deafening. The air in the room grew colder, and I could see my breath forming faint clouds in front of me. The shuffle outside the door grew louder, more frantic. I heard a faint, wheezing sound, like breathing, but wrong. It wasn't human, but it was alive. My heart pounded as I tried to think of a rational explanation. Maybe it was an animal, a raccoon or stray dog that had somehow gotten onto the ship. I clung to the thought because the alternative, that it was something much worse, was too terrifying to consider. The 12th chime came with a bone-rattling intensity. The fluorescent light in the office flickered, casting the room in quick bursts of shadow and light. I stared at the door, my mind racing. The shuffling stopped. Silence enveloped the room, but it wasn't comforting. It was the kind of silence that screamed at you to listen harder. I stayed completely still, afraid that even the smallest movement would give away my presence. Then came the 13th toll. It was different, deeper, like the ship itself had groaned in response. The lights flickered one last time and went out, plunging the office into darkness. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to control my fear. I reached for my flashlight, fumbling with the switch. When it clicked on, the beam of light revealed the empty office, the shadows retreating into the corners. But the quiet outside the door had changed. The shuffling had stopped, but now I could hear something else, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It sounded like knuckles lightly rapping against the steel door. My grip on the flashlight tightened, and I aimed it at the door, half expecting to see it bulge inward from the force of whatever was on the other side. The tapping grew louder, insistent. And then it stopped, replaced by a voice. It was low and raspy, just loud enough to carry through the metal. "Mercer," it said. "Come out and join me." My blood ran cold. That voice knew my name. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I kept my flashlight aimed at the door, as if the beam of light could keep whatever it was at bay. The voice didn't come again, but I could feel its presence, lingering just outside, waiting. The minutes dragged on. The flashlight started to flicker, its battery straining, and I silently cursed myself for not checking them before the shift started. I stared at the door, willing it to hold against whatever was out there. Eventually, the weight in the air began to lift, and the temperature in the room slowly returned to normal. When the light returned, dim and steady, I dared to check the time. It was 12:30 a.m. The bell had stopped, and the ship had fallen silent once more. I sat there for what felt like hours, unable to move, waiting for another noise, another sign that I wasn't alone. But nothing came. Finally, I forced myself to breathe and stand up. My legs felt like jelly, and my heart hammered in my chest. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the note with the rules, reading it again. I hadn't believed it before, but now it felt like gospel. I couldn't explain what had just happened, but I knew it wasn't over. Whatever had been outside that door was still somewhere on this ship, waiting for me to break another rule. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me like a second skin. The events of the night played over and over in my head, the tolling bell, the voice that knew my name, the oppressive presence that had lingered just outside the door. Part of me wanted to call Robert and quit right then and there, but the other part of me, the part that had been trained to finish what I started, wouldn't allow it. This job was supposed to be my fresh start, my way of rebuilding myself after years of regret. I couldn't walk away just because the ship decided to play tricks on me. At least, that's what I told myself. By the time my next shift rolled around, I had worked myself into a state of cautious determination. I arrived at the Sovereign just before sunset, clutching a fresh flashlight and a few spare batteries like they were lifelines. I tried not to think about the rules as I made my way up the gangplank, but the note sat heavy in my pocket, a constant reminder of what waited for me inside. The ship seemed even more oppressive in the dying light. The fading sun cast long shadows across the deck, and the faint creak of the hull settling in the water echoed like ghostly footsteps. I made my way to the security office, locking the door behind me before setting up for the night. I checked the cameras, made sure my radio was working, and double-checked the batteries in my flashlight. Everything seemed normal, almost too normal, as if the ship was trying to lull me into a false sense of security. It wasn't until I started my rounds that I began to feel the ship's presence again. The corridors seemed narrower tonight, the shadows darker and more oppressive. The air smelled faintly of salt and mildew, and every creak and groan of the ship made my heart jump. I stuck to the main hallways, avoiding the darker, less traveled paths. I wasn't ready to test my luck just yet. As I passed the grand staircase, I couldn't help but glance up to where I had seen the captain last night. The space was empty, but the memory of his glowing eyes sent a shiver down my spine. I quickened my pace, eager to put distance between myself and that part of the ship. The rest of my first round was uneventful, but the unease never left me. I returned to the security office, checking the cameras again. Most of the feeds showed empty hallways and dimly lit rooms, but one camera, focused on the ballroom, flickered with static. My stomach sank as I stared at the screen, half expecting something to lunge into view. But the static cleared after a few moments, revealing the empty ballroom, its polished floors gleaming under the faint light of the chandeliers. I told myself it was just a glitch, but the knot in my stomach didn't loosen. I decided to take a break, sitting back in the office chair and letting out a shaky breath. My fingers found the note in my pocket, and I unfolded it, reading the rules again. My eyes lingered on rule number 2, don't touch the gold coins on the table in the captain's quarters. I hadn't seen the captain's quarters yet, and I wasn't eager to go looking for them. But a part of me, curiosity or stupidity, I wasn't sure which, wanted to know if the coins were really there. I folded the note back up and tucked it away, trying to push the thought from my mind. My second round started off much the same as the first, quiet and tense. The ship seemed to hold its breath as I moved through its halls, my footsteps the only sound in the oppressive silence. I avoided the staircase again, sticking to the lower decks. But as I passed a narrow corridor near the engine room, I heard it, a faint, melodic whistling. The sound stopped me in my tracks. It was light and cheerful, almost like someone was trying to mimic a bird's song. But it didn't belong here, not in this cold, empty ship. My heart raced as I remembered rule number 5, if you hear whistling in the engine room, leave immediately. I wasn't in the engine room yet, but I was close enough that the sound shouldn't have been possible. I turned on my flashlight, aiming it down the corridor, but it only illuminated the walls and floor, worn with age and neglect. The whistling continued, growing louder, and I took a step back, my instinct screaming at me to leave. I hurried back to the security office, my skin prickling with unease. As soon as I closed the door behind me, the whistling stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its place. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, and looked at the monitors again. This time, the camera feed for the engine room was black. Not static, just black, like something had covered the lens. My chest tightened, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I didn't sleep at all the next day. I couldn't stop thinking about the whistling, the blacked-out camera, and the rules that seemed less like warnings and more like commandments. I thought about calling Robert, demanding answers, but I doubted he would give me any. This job was a test, and I had the sinking feeling that failing it would mean more than just getting fired. When night fell again, I found myself back on the ship, dreading whatever new horrors awaited me. The rules weren't just guidelines, they were a lifeline. If I wanted to survive this job, I would have to follow them to the letter. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't be enough. The Sovereign wasn't just haunted, it was alive. And it wasn't going to let me go without a fight. On my third night aboard the RMS Sovereign, the air was colder, and the silence heavier than before. Every creak and groan of the ship seemed amplified, echoing in my mind like an accusation. The unease had become a constant companion, an invisible weight pressing on my chest as I prepared for my rounds. I decided to begin with the upper decks. Avoiding the engine room was non-negotiable after the whistling incident, and the thought of venturing near the captain's quarters had my stomach twisting in knots. Still, the rules were clear, and I intended to follow them. I locked the security office door as instructed, double-checked the cameras, and stepped out into the dimly lit hallway. The grand staircase was my first stop. Its ornate banisters and gleaming wood had once been a symbol of the ship's opulence, but now it felt like a gateway to something darker. The faint sound of my boots on the polished floor filled the space, and I hesitated before moving past the staircase, eyes flickering upward. I didn't see the captain tonight, but the memory of his hollow gaze lingered, like a shadow burned into my mind. As I made my way down the hall, a faint sound caught my attention, a soft, rhythmic thudding, like footsteps. I froze, turning my head toward the noise, but it stopped as abruptly as it had started. My hand instinctively went to the flashlight on my belt, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to see whatever had made that sound. Instead, I pressed on, forcing myself to take measured steps even as my pulse quickened. The captain's quarters were on the next deck, and my curiosity wrestled with my better judgment as I approached. The door was a dark, imposing presence at the end of the corridor, with brass fittings dulled by time and a faint sheen of moisture clinging to its surface. My fingers brushed the folded rules in my pocket, the warning about the coins clear in my mind. Don't touch the gold coins on the table in the captain's quarters. I didn't intend to go in, but I couldn't deny the pull of that room. It was as if the Sovereign herself was daring me to break the rule, to test the boundaries of her wrath. The door creaked open as if on cue, the sound low and drawn out, like a breath exhaled from the ship's lungs. I froze, caught between fear and curiosity, my heart hammering in my chest. Inside, the room was bathed in a faint golden light, illuminating a scene both beautiful and grotesque. The table in the center of the room was adorned with ornate carvings, and atop it sat a small pile of gold coins, gleaming like they had been polished that very day. They didn't belong here, not in this decayed husk of a ship. They were too perfect, too pristine, and their presence felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I knew I should leave, but my feet carried me forward. The air in the room was heavy, thick with the smell of salt and something metallic, blood, maybe. My hand reached out as if compelled by an unseen force, hovering over the coins. The moment I touched one, a shock ran through me, cold and electric, and the room shifted. The walls seemed to pulse, and a low, guttural hum filled the air. I snatched my hand back, the coin clutched tightly in my palm, and stumbled toward the door. The hallway was gone. In its place was a vast, open space filled with shadowy figures. They were dressed in finery from another era, their faces obscured by masks that twisted and changed with each step they took. Laughter echoed around me, high and shrill, but there was no joy in it. It was mocking, hollow, and filled with malice. My pulse thundered in my ears as I tried to orient myself, to find some way back to the world I knew. The captain appeared at the far end of the space, his figure larger than life, his eyes glowing like twin lanterns. He didn't speak, but his presence was a command, a force that drew me closer despite every instinct screaming at me to run. I held the coin out toward him, hoping to placate him, but he raised a hand, and the laughter ceased. The silence that followed was deafening, suffocating, and I felt the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes on me. The room collapsed in on itself, and I found myself back in the hallway outside the captain's quarters. The door was closed, the golden light gone, but the coin was still in my hand, its surface cold and smooth. My breathing was ragged, and my legs felt like they might give out at any moment. I tucked the coin into my pocket, unsure of what else to do, and made my way back to the security office. The cameras were static when I arrived, every feed a blur of white noise. I sank into the chair, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but my thoughts were scattered, disjointed. The ship felt alive around me, its walls pulsing faintly with a rhythm I couldn't ignore. I pulled the coin from my pocket, staring at it in the pale light of the monitor. It seemed ordinary now, but I knew better. It was a piece of the sovereign, a tether to something far beyond my understanding. As the hours dragged on, the ship grew quieter, the silence a living thing that pressed against my ears. I didn't hear the captain's voice again that night, but I felt his presence, lingering just out of sight. I knew then that I had made a mistake, one that couldn't be undone. The rules weren't just a warning, they were a lifeline. And I had let go of mine. The next evening, I stepped back onto the sovereign with the weight of the previous night heavy on my shoulders. Sleep had been impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the captain's glowing gaze and the laughing shadows in that phantom ballroom. My pocket felt heavier than it should, the cursed coin like a lead weight pulling me closer to the ship's abyss. I tried not to think about it as I locked the security office door and prepared for my rounds, but the faint pulse of the ship seemed louder, more insistent, like a heartbeat just beneath the surface of the walls. The rules had never felt more vital. I read them again and again, the words taking on a grim authority. If the ship's bell rings at midnight, stay where you are and don't move until it stops. I thought about the strange journal I'd found and the broken accounts of those who came before me. I thought about the cold that seeped into my bones each time I crossed the threshold of the captain's quarters. And I thought about the eyes of the drowned passengers I had seen in my vision, unblinking, endless, and filled with hatred. Midnight came too quickly. I was near the ballroom when the ship's bell rang out, a sharp, metallic peal that seemed to vibrate through every inch of the vessel. The sound made my teeth ache, and I froze where I stood, clenching my fists to keep from trembling. The bell rang again, and then again, each chime louder than the last. I counted them, my breath shallow. 6, 7, 8. I didn't dare move, didn't even blink, as the sound grew deafening. On the 12th chime, the air seemed to thicken, and I felt something brush past me. It wasn't wind, there was no wind inside the ship, but a presence, cold and heavy, dragging through the space like a shadow come to life. My heart raced as I waited for the final chime, and when it came, the oppressive weight lifted, leaving behind a hollow silence. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to stay rooted in place for another moment, until I was sure the danger had passed. I should have gone back to the security office then, but something stopped me. A faint sound, like footsteps on metal, echoed through the corridor ahead. I tried to tell myself it was just the creaking of the ship, the natural groans of old steel and wood settling in the cold night air, but the sound didn't match the rhythm of the ship's usual noises. It was deliberate, steady, and growing louder. Against my better judgment, I moved toward the sound. The beam of my flashlight trembled as I swept it across the hallway, illuminating only empty space and shadow. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a low, mournful whistling. My blood ran cold. If you hear whistling in the engine room, leave immediately. The engine room was on the lower deck, far from where I was standing, but the sound seemed to come from all around me. The melody was haunting, almost hypnotic, and I found myself drawn toward it despite every nerve in my body screaming for me to run. My fingers brushed against the coin in my pocket, and for a brief moment, the whistling grew louder, sharper, as if acknowledging its presence. I turned and bolted. My footsteps echoed wildly as I ran back to the security office, slamming the door behind me and locking it with shaking hands. The whistling didn't follow me, but the silence it left behind was worse. It was the silence of a predator waiting, watching, biding its time. I sank into the chair, my breaths ragged, and checked the security cameras. One of the feeds had gone static, the camera outside the engine room. My pulse quickened as I stared at the screen, willing it to stabilize, but the static only deepened, the faint outline of a shadow appearing in the background. I tore my gaze away and gripped the edge of the desk, trying to steady myself. The coin in my pocket burned against my skin, and I knew I couldn't keep it any longer. The journal had mentioned a ritual, a way to sever the captain's hold over the ship, but the details were maddeningly incomplete. It spoke of an altar in the engine room, a place where the coin had to be returned, but it also warned of the captain's strongest enforcers guarding the area. I wasn't ready for that, not yet, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. The hours dragged on, each second stretching into an eternity. Every creak of the ship made me jump, every flicker of the lights sent my heart racing. I felt trapped, not just by the sovereign but by my own fear, by the weight of the rules and the knowledge that breaking them could bring horrors I wasn't equipped to face. The ship wasn't just haunted, it was alive, a malevolent force that fed on my terror, tightening its grip with every passing moment. By the time dawn broke, the tension in my chest had become unbearable. I stepped outside into the cool morning air, hoping to clear my head, but the sight of the empty dock did little to calm my nerves. The ship loomed behind me, its dark silhouette cutting against the pale light of the rising sun. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting for me to return. The coin still rested in my pocket, a constant reminder of my failure to follow the rules. I wanted to throw it into the ocean, to rid myself of its curse, but I knew it wouldn't let me go so easily. The sovereign had claimed me, and no matter how far I ran, I could feel its shadow clinging to me like a second skin. That night, I prepared myself for the confrontation I had been avoiding. The journal's instructions were maddeningly vague, but it was clear, if I wanted to rid myself of the coin's curse, I had to return it to the altar in the engine room. My hands trembled as I secured the laminated rules in my jacket pocket and stuffed the journal alongside them. The flashlight's weight in my grip felt reassuring, even if I doubted it would do much against the forces lurking on the Sovereign. The ship felt different as I stepped aboard. The usual creaks and groans of the hull seemed amplified, almost mocking, as though the Sovereign itself knew what I was planning. The cold air sank deep into my bones, and every shadow along the walls seemed to twist and shift when I wasn't looking. I locked the security office behind me, just like the rules demanded, and checked the cameras. The feed near the engine room flickered faintly, showing glimpses of the corridor beyond, but nothing out of the ordinary. For now. I started my rounds, trying to steady my nerves. The grand ballroom loomed to my right, its darkened interior promising dangers I wasn't ready to face again. My steps carried me down the narrow crew passageways, past the kitchen and into the lower decks, the air growing colder with each step. The coin burned in my pocket, a reminder of the captain's ever-watchful presence. The whistling started faintly, barely audible at first, but as I descended the final stairwell toward the engine room, it grew louder. The melody was haunting, carrying with it a sense of longing and malice. My breathing quickened as I gripped the flashlight tighter, its beam slicing through the thick shadows ahead. The walls were slick with condensation, the metal groaning under its own weight as though the Sovereign herself were alive and restless. When I reached the entrance to the engine room, the door was ajar. My stomach churned. I had locked it earlier that evening during my first rounds, but now it hung open, inviting me into the ship's darkest depths. The whistling ceased abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against my ears like cotton. The engine room was massive, a labyrinth of rusted pipes and towering machinery. The altar was exactly as described in the journal, a simple metal table stained with blackened marks, set in the center of the room. The coin in my pocket seemed to grow heavier as I approached it, the air around me thick with an invisible force that resisted my every step. And then I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps, deliberate and slow, echoing through the room. I spun around, my flashlight slicing through the shadows, but nothing was there. My breath came in shallow gasps as the footsteps grew louder, closer. My military instincts kicked in, and I ducked behind a column, clutching the coin in one hand and the flashlight in the other. A figure emerged from the far side of the room, stepping into the dim glow of a flickering overhead light. It was the captain. His uniform was immaculate, the gold trim gleaming despite the room's decay, but his face was pale and unnatural, his glowing eyes fixed on the altar. He didn't seem to notice me as he moved toward the table, his movements stiff and deliberate, like a marionette on invisible strings. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed. The journal had warned about the captain's enforcers, the spirits bound to his will, but it hadn't mentioned facing him directly. As he reached the altar, he paused, his head tilting slightly as though listening for something. And then he turned, his glowing eyes locking onto mine. A wave of cold washed over me as I staggered backward, the coin slipping from my grip and clattering to the floor. The captain's lips curled into a grin that didn't belong on a human face, his teeth unnaturally sharp and glinting in the dim light. "You've broken the rules," he said, his voice a low rumble that echoed through the room. "And now you'll pay the price." The shadows around him came alive, swirling and coalescing into humanoid shapes with hollow, glowing eyes. They advanced toward me, their movements jerky and unnatural, their hollow faces fixed in grotesque grins. My flashlight flickered wildly, the beam casting erratic shadows that only heightened the terror. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. The journal had mentioned salt, something about its power to weaken the captain's hold over his enforcers. I tore open a nearby cabinet, my fingers fumbling through the supplies until I found a small container of salt. As the shadows closed in, I flung the salt in their direction, and they recoiled, their forms dissolving into wisps of smoke. But the captain remained, his grin widening as he stepped closer. I grabbed the coin from the floor and sprinted toward the altar, every step feeling like I was wading through quicksand. The air grew colder, the oppressive force stronger, but I forced myself forward. With a final burst of adrenaline, I slammed the coin onto the altar and recited the words from the journal, my voice trembling but steady. The room trembled violently, the machinery groaning and screeching as the captain let out a guttural roar. The shadows around him twisted and writhed, their forms unraveling as the ship seemed to come alive, rejecting its malevolent master. The captain lunged toward me, his glowing eyes filled with fury, but as the final words left my lips, he stopped short. His form began to fade, his body dissolving into the same smoky tendrils as his enforcers. His roar echoed one final time before silence consumed the room. I collapsed to the floor, my body shaking with exhaustion and relief. The oppressive air lifted, and for the first time since I'd started this job, the Sovereign felt still. As the ship settled into an eerie quiet, I lay on the cold, greasy floor of the engine room, trying to steady my ragged breathing. The shadows that had once clawed at me were gone, dissipated into the air like a bad dream. The altar, now dark and lifeless, held no sign of the cursed coin. I reached for it cautiously, but my fingers met only the cold metal surface of the table. It was gone, taking with it the weight that had haunted me since my first mistake. I pulled myself upright, every muscle in my body protesting. The faint hum of the ship's machinery returned, the rhythmic thrum grounding me back in the reality of the moment. The Sovereign, for the first time, felt like just a ship, no whispers in the dark, no malevolent figures lurking just out of sight. Still, the memory of the captain's glowing eyes and the weight of his malevolence lingered in my mind like a stain I couldn't scrub away. I stumbled back to the security office, desperate for a reprieve. My steps echoed down the empty corridors, the sound unnervingly loud. My flashlight flickered weakly, but I didn't dare stop to change the batteries. The Sovereign might have seemed calm, but I knew better than to trust the silence. The rules hadn't prepared me for this kind of confrontation, and for all I knew, the captain's hold over the ship might still have threads left to pull. When I reached the office, I locked the door behind me and slumped into the chair, letting out a shaky breath. My mind raced with the events of the night, replaying every detail in vivid clarity. I glanced at the security monitors, half expecting to see something unnatural, but all the feeds were clear. The grand ballroom was empty, the portholes showed nothing but the dark expanse of the harbor, and the corridors were still. I was alone, but the solitude brought little comfort. I reached into my pocket for the laminated rules, needing some semblance of order after the chaos. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper, reading over the familiar list. The words were the same, but something about them felt heavier now, as if they carried the weight of the night's events. I lingered on rule number 3, If the ship's bell rings at midnight, stay where you are and don't move until it stops. My stomach twisted at the thought of what might have happened if I'd ignored that one, too. My eyes flicked to the clock on the wall, 3:47 a.m. Dawn wasn't far off. I clung to that thought, hoping the first rays of sunlight would chase away whatever remnants of the captain's power still lingered on the Sovereign. But just as I allowed myself a sliver of hope, a soft sound reached my ears, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the hallway outside the office. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate, like someone, or something, was knocking in a slow, calculated rhythm. My mind screamed at me to ignore it, to stay inside and wait for sunrise, but the dread in my chest was suffocating. The rules didn't mention anything about knocking at this hour, but after everything I'd seen, I wasn't about to take any chances. The tapping stopped, replaced by a soft, low whistle that sent shivers down my spine. I recognized it immediately. It was the same haunting melody I'd heard in the engine room. My pulse quickened, and I gripped the flashlight tightly, its flickering beam offering little reassurance. I kept my eyes locked on the door, praying it would hold against whatever was out there. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the whistling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against my ears like a physical weight. I stayed motionless, every fiber of my being screaming at me not to move, not to make a sound. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and still, nothing happened. Finally, the clock on the wall chimed softly, signaling the arrival of 4 a.m. A wave of relief washed over me, though it was tinged with exhaustion and lingering fear. I let out a shaky breath and slumped back in the chair, my grip on the flashlight loosening. The ship remained silent, and for the first time in hours, I allowed myself to believe the worst was over. As the first light of dawn crept through the portholes, I gathered my belongings, ready to leave the Sovereign behind for good. The ship's oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift slightly with the morning light, though the memories of the night still clung to me like a second skin. I locked the office door behind me and made my way to the main deck, the cool morning air a welcome contrast to the stifling darkness I'd endured. When I stepped onto the gangplank, I felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. The Sovereign's imposing silhouette loomed behind me, a stark reminder of the horrors I'd faced. I glanced back at the ship one last time, half expecting to see the captain watching me from one of the portholes, but there was nothing. Just an empty, silent vessel. I walked to my car, the crunch of gravel under my boots the only sound in the stillness. As I slid into the driver's seat, I noticed something on the passenger seat, a small, gleaming object catching the morning light. My heart sank as I realized what it was, the cursed coin, its surface polished and unblemished, as if the events of the night had never happened. I stared at the coin, a cold dread settling in my chest. My hands shook as I reached for it, but I stopped short, too afraid to touch it. The captain's voice echoed in my mind, his taunting words a cruel reminder of the ship's power. No matter how far I drove, no matter how many miles I put between myself and the Sovereign, I knew the curse wasn't done with me. The engine roared to life as I started the car, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. The coin sat untouched on the passenger seat, a grim reminder that some things can't be escaped. As I drove away, the faint sound of the ship's bell rang in my ears, a haunting melody that promised I'd be back.